Musical Talk, the UK's independent musical theatre podcast. Hello and welcome to another edition of Musical Talk. I'm Thos Ribbits. And so am I. Yes, and as you can see, I've got to that stage in the quarantine period where I'm already talking to myself. No, you're not. Yes, I am. And I'm not sure it's a very healthy thing. But then again, it's a very unnatural way that we're all living at the moment as we live through the COVID-19 pandemic. And much of the world's population is, as I am, in lockdown or quarantined. However you want to look at it, we really aren't allowed to go outside very much at all. And that can be very difficult to cope with. Many people are living with other people, but many of us are not. I personally am on my own. Are you sure? Go away! Despite what you're hearing, I do live on my own. I don't find it too much of a problem, but I appreciate that many people do. But, as you are undoubtedly aware, there is help, or at least some help, at hand, because the best night that I have had in quarantine was watching the stage production live stream of the British touring version of Curtains by Kandra and Ebb. I'd seen it when it had come to London just before Christmas, and I was going to see it again when it got to Southampton. Of course, that latter part of the national tour was cancelled, very sadly, but the people behind the show very kindly put it online for one day only, or rather it was only going to be one day only. Due to technical problems, they then did it on 2 days. And on both occasions, I watched it and had a marvellous time. I saw that show twice, a pair of curtains, if you will. And the thing it did for me was it really took me out of myself. So one night a week now, whilst the lockdown continues, I have a theatre night, where I find a show that's been live streamed and I watch it from start to finish as though I was in a theatre. And I must tell you, it's a marvellous thing to do. If you've not had a chance to do it yet, do try. And if you can make a donation, then please do if you can. That money will go to support people in the performance industry. And there's no shortage of things to see. There are platforms where you can rent shows or take out a subscription, and a good one of those is Broadway HD, which has a large section devoted to musicals, and quite right too, although it certainly wouldn't harm itself if it wanted to put more on. In Britain, we have digital theatre, that can be found at www.digitaltheatre.com, and they have a selection of theatre and musicals, including the acclaimed version of Stephen Sondheim's Into the Woods, which you could have seen at the Regent's Park Open Air Theatre a few years ago, and I did. Rather splendidly, it featured real trees. Really added to the production values, I thought that, funnily enough. You could really declare it was 70 years in the making in some senses. And then, of course, there's Andrew Lloyd Webber, who I think very generously has been putting up for limited amounts of times fantastic recordings of some of his best-known shows. We've so far had Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, The Phantom of the Opera, Love Never Dies, Jesus Christ Superstar, and that list goes on and on. The website for that is the Shows Must Go On YouTube channel, and remember those broadcasts go up on Friday night at 7 o'clock British time and are only available for 48 hours, so there's only a limited window for those. And there are lots more. A really good source for finding a regularly updated list of many of the shows, theatre and musical, that you can catch either for free or for a small amount of money is the What's On Stage website. It's where I go and I have found a lot of gems. Everything from Flowers for Mrs. Harris from the Chichester Festival to 21 Chump Street, a short musical by Lin-Manuel Miranda. And plenty more besides if you look for it, so do make a point of seeing what you can find. But the mention of Lin-Manuel Miranda takes us, I think, into the meat of today's programme. Because whilst 21 Chump Street is a bit of an oddity these days, he of course is most famous for the enormous hit Hamilton. A show that did miraculously in America on Broadway and elsewhere in the world, and of course came to London a few years ago and was a massive success here as well, and is undoubtedly going to be a success again when the theatres reopen. But I have a small problem with Hamilton. And before we go anywhere, please don't write to me. I absolutely accept that it is a great show. I have no doubt that it is written with a great deal of class, a great deal of intelligence. It's being performed marvellously, and it is a step forward in some way in the format and form of musical theatre. But my principal problems are twofold. It was associated with far too much hype when it first came to London, and I'm one of these contrarians who generally finds hype to be a turn off rather than a turn on, so that pushed me away rather than drew me in. And secondly, and I'm sorry to say this, it's about a subject I'm not vastly interested in, which is not in any way to downplay the excellence of the piece. It's just not a piece that I fancy seeing, at least in the short term, although I'm sure I shall in the future. Someone who has seen it, and has some very strong opinions on it, is an old friend of this programme, Tim Saywood. And so shortly after he last saw it, I sat down with Tim for one of our customary, wide-ranging, tangential, but I hope generally entertaining conversations about Hamilton and the worth of Hamilton. So whilst we're waiting for those theatres to reopen so that we can go and see Hamilton and lots of other shows, let's listen to this conversation I had with Tim Saywood about this groundbreaking, or is it, show. Is the boring bit over yet? Shut up. And yes, it is. Musical talk. Well, hello, Tim.
Hello.
Today we're going to talk about something which is going to be one of those recurring themes, I think, on Musical Talk for some months, years probably,
yes.
Which is the import or otherwise of a well-known American musical currently playing in London called, and I bring myself to say this with a slight sigh, there it was, Hamilton.
Hamilton, that's right, yeah.
Now,
what's the sigh about?
Well, for me, this is my problem. I don't want to prejudge Hamilton, but I've already said this on a previous episode of Musical Talk with Nick Hudson. I have a slight problem with this show, which is it was so packaged as the greatest musical ever written.
Right.
It was so hyped, both before it came to London and then when it came to London for the London production. But actually I find myself being pushed away from it because of that level of hype. When it comes to, and I've used this before, Will Compertz, who's a man I admire very much, the BBC's cultural editor on the BBC News, actually asked the author if he was the new Shakespeare. He had the good grace to say, no, of course I'm not.
No, as it happens.
Yes, but that was a ridiculous question. But that's been the level at which the whole thing has been pitched.
Right.
There's also a secondary issue for me, which is actually the story of Hamilton, as far as I'm aware of it, is not something that vastly interests me. It's not a period of history that culturally I connect with. It's certainly from the American point of view. It's also not a story that naturally excites me. Now, because it's clearly an important musical, and I don't deny it. It's clearly a good musical because the reviews are more or less unanimous on that. I will go and see it at some stage when the dust has settled. I have a feeling that the dust storm about this... the dust storm on this is going to be so phenomenal that it will be some time. So I've got a couple of questions for you because you have seen it and
yes.
you have come to your own independent views.
Yes.
But the first issue, I suppose, is taking Allegro by Rodgers and Hammerstein as the model, which was cutting edge, possibly a bit ahead of its time, and sold marvellously in terms of tickets in advance.
Yes.
But once actually the dust had settled, no one else then bought any tickets and it closed after 3 years, and then was never revived for 75 years. Where are we with Hamilton? Not setting my stall out in any way, not trying to...
You mean will it be entirely forgotten in 5 years?
Yes, or maybe 10 years.
In the next 5 years. It won't. For 2 or 3 reasons, I think, would make it... I think it's very, very different indeed from the example you've chosen, Allegro. And
this is aggro.
Indeed, yeah. Let's just consider why the hype exists, and there's no doubt about that, and there is enormous hype around it. So let's just sort of try and unpack a little bit why... and where this hype has come from. What are the things that make it... First of all, I think you've picked on 2 very important things as to why perhaps it hasn't worked as well for you. The story of Alexander Hamilton, a founding father of the United States, is in the United States an artefact of extreme importance, like historical importance. It's the sort of thing... I mean, perhaps his particular story hasn't been told or been brought to prominence in quite the same way as it has been through this musical, but the legend of the founding fathers in general and of the independence movement is is mother's milk, really.
It's the American DNA.
In America. You learn it at school.
Yeah.
You know who these people are. You've heard the name George Washington, obviously. You've heard the name Thomas Jefferson, and so on. So they've
all had musicals, Tim.
Exactly.
They've all had musicals.
So the Conjuring, there's 1776, a famous example. So the Conjuring that this is doing with those iconic figures is part of where it draws its significance from. And I think...
So there is no place for calm, cool, considerate men.
It basically, you have, it basically taps into this founding mythology of the states. And so first of all, that's part of where it draws its significance from. So it's always going to feel a bit more significant in the States than it would here, I think. And I don't know that we even have an equivalent founding myth other than things like Magna Carta or stuff like that, but none of that really...
Well, can I make an observation, actually? Yeah. I think it's very strange because we have the opposite myth. The American myth is about success in war.
Yes.
And if there is a founding event in British history, it is 1066, the last time we were successfully invaded, i.e. us, if you see yourself as Anglo-Saxon, as losing
well, that's
a
big
war.
Shift, yeah.
But it's a fundamentally different position.
But yeah, so they arrive with the Normans and the... but anyway, let's not get down that path of history because that's a whole other set of musicals, Blondel among them. And come back to this. So, one, it's historically... what it deals with is historically significant. Two, where does it sit in the history of musicals in the way that I don't think really Allegro can be said to? Well, obviously it's...
Really, by the way?
No,
it's interesting.
In terms of formal innovation, not at all. It acquires a lot of its significance from the fact that this is the first... fully mainstream, shall we say, the crossover hip-hop musical. This is the one whose coming has been foretold sort of thing, for a few years. So we've had In the Heights by Lin-Manuel Miranda, we've had an assortment of attempts at this.
Into the Hoods.
Well, yes, exactly, or not a
to a degree,
yes. But there have been many attempts to sort of co-opt and bring in hip-hop and rap specifically as a form and use it in a musical, and there have been lots of attempts, and some of them very artistically successful. But this is the first time it's really... just struck gold in the sense of commercial success as well as, cultural success. And of course, for those not particularly paying attention to the musical theatre scene, this comes as a bit of a surprise, because if you weren't aware of things like In the Heights and so on, the precursors that Lin-Manuel Miranda had done, then you might not particularly understand how they would attempt hip-hop in a musical context.
You mean it seems to come fully formed out of nowhere if you don't? If you've not been looking.
And suddenly people are going, God, that's really clever. You can actually use it. You can get through a whole load of words much more quickly. You can do a whole load of plot stuff. It obviously it's much more interesting. Those again who sort of classify musical theatre as sort of the easy listening, the things your mum might like
Ossified.
or your dad might like. What we now think of the Lloyd Webbers as being, and indeed the Rodgers and Hammerstones before them. This does feel like something fresh, though, in the same way that I think Rent probably felt when that first came out. And Rent is a little more forgotten now, true. But then Rent was doing fewer things formally that were new. I think that's, for example, Hair before that had, and Hair is remembered, and I think this is on the par with that really. So I think that's a better parallel. Like, a new musical genre has...
Can I just say, it should have 4 letters in, so it should be Rent, Hair and Hammy.
Okay, well, Ham, they do, Ham, yeah. Or Burr, perhaps, would have been a better choice in that case. But Hair burst into most people's consciousness as something that, this isn't really a musical. It's not a musical as we understand it. It's using, contemporary style music, and there's folk things, and there's soul, and there's all sorts of things. And it's just not really what we've heard of in a musical before, unless you count Bye Bye Birdie, So,
I suppose what you seem to be saying is actually that every now and then, musical theatre since the advent of Rodgers and Hammerstein and essentially the Second World War, after them, because they changed the tone and they changed the concept, every now and then a forward-thinking piece of musical theatre comes along, which
there's a quantum leap,
which is authentically talking in the voice of popular music of that period, not commercial necessarily, or it might be, but actually, and so Hair is the example of that.
Yes,
as you say, Rent was as far as it was, and now Hamilton is doing something a little bit. Well, you do have another famous maxim here, though, Tim, which is that musical theatre is never up to date. It is always 10
years,
at least
behind, which of course
and that is where we are now.
Indeed, yeah, and it is, and of course it is, but it's the first time that I think most people will be conscious. And there's a third element to the significance of it, and this sort of comes out of the fact that you've got these two things, a founding fathers mythology and hip hop music. Now, the two things in America, and indeed here really, are held in strong opposition. The notion of sort of 18th century conventions and politics and these sorts of things, it's the stuff of history books, obviously.
Yeah.
It's the stuff of pomposity, and it's the stuff, let's be honest, I think in a lot of people's minds, of white America, because those founding myths and the freedoms that they're talking about predate significantly the abolition of slavery even, let alone the civil rights movement and any of those things.
Can I say this treason? There's an element of empty words.
How do you mean?
In the American Constitution?
Yes, I think that's probably it was
certainly
true.
at that time, anyway.
Certainly Jefferson owned slaves and Washington owned slaves and all the rest of it, and they were, a lot of them were Southerners. And indeed, it is discussed in this musical as well, that very issue. So I think the boldest thing that it does in terms of the production, and this didn't have to be a feature of the production, but it is that it's, I suppose, the same sort of slight enjoyment that we get out of seeing George III portrayed as a kind of slightly Freddie Mercury-ish, Electric Light Orchestra-ish type of sort of,
soul singer kind of thing, isn't he?
Songster, yeah. That same sort of enjoyment is delivered 100-fold by the fact that there is casting of black actors as founding fathers, and there's just something that is inevitably going to feel subversive in a good or in a not so good way to different people coming to this thing with different political opinions. And it's landed, although it is a pre-Trump invention, and it certainly was being produced and developed way before President Trump was thought of, but it seems to have landed at a moment in history where it sort of acquired further legendary status by the rebuke that was offered to Mike Pence in the early, the early stages after the election, when he was still the vice president-elect, about the kind of country that it sort of represents in a way, about
just
the
for
kind
people
of
who don't
change
remember
that
this
it
story.
represents.
This is that Mr. Pence went as an audience member to see the show.
I think
at the end of the
days
show,
after the election, I think this was.
And the members of the cast at the time got to the end of the performance and then made a public address to him.
Yeah,
or a request, I suppose, wasn't it?
I think
it was
talking about
done,
wanting to have an inclusive country that was accepting of all races, genders, and so forth, and sexualities and so on. Yeah, well, exactly. I mean, the fact that it sort of needed to be said was what was significant there, and they seemed to be the right people to deliver that message, because there they were sort of saying, right, let's explicitly connect what is generally considered this very white myth of the founding of the states to the fact that actually the founding fathers were more racially diverse than tends to be sort of discussed, and secondly, in the fact that let's do this in a language which did originate in Black America and New York, and in a musical language that originated there.
So contextually, it's been lucky.
That's why it's a big deal, and I think
Would it have been 10 years ago?
I think it absolutely would have been 10 years
but
ago,
not because of the context.
And I think. I think politically, it would have been. Well, it would have been 10 years ago, precisely because Barack Obama was becoming the president 10 years ago, but for different reasons. It basically represents a sort of cultural change that's gone on, and that in the current version of the culture war, Barack Obama is on one side and President Trump is very much perceived as being on the other, the very opposite side, really. And it's the culture war that that goes on, and hopefully one of these days will get resolved. Who knows? Yeah. Anyway, that's why it's significant for three reasons then. Politically, because of just what it represents about sort of, whose country is this anyway kind of thing. And secondly, in terms of whose musical theatre is this anyway, well, it now is, there's a generational baton that seems to be passing. Now, there's an interesting thing about Hair here, which is that, and I'm sorry, I've got rid of the Allegro comparison. I'm now focusing on the Hair comparison instead.
I'm perfectly happy with that.
But Hair had successors, but not necessarily following in the same form that Hair had invented. Like, Hair's not a massively coherent work, for example. It's a very sort of free and easy sort of thing. As befits its sort of hippie-ish nature. And so it doesn't have that many successors that are an awful lot like Hair, in the same way that, for example, Showboat in Oklahoma had an awful lot of successors which were dramaturgically and musically an awful lot like them.
Are we about to say that Hair has become fringe?
Oh, God.
And relax.
And there's my sigh. And so it's difficult to point to whether this is just like an outlier or is the beginning of something new. It strikes me that it probably is the beginning of something new, and I think the reason I would say that is because the way that hip-hop can deal with plot detail and the speed with which it can dispatch words, enormous, means that actually there's a new storytelling device that most musical theatre writers would be foolish to ignore, I think, now.
I'm not going to disagree.
The sung through musical was similarly influential. So, for example, having had the Rodgers and Hammerstein book musical type, you get in the early 80s this sudden upsurge of sung through musicals, the Boodle and Schoenbergs and the Lloyd Webbers, and that creates a new sort of language for telling musical theatre stories, or not bothering to, perhaps, arguably. And now this is something else again.
But can I just finesse what you've said a little bit? Because I don't disagree with you, but it seems to me that, for want of a better phrase, rap stroke hip-hop is a very lyric-heavy kind of music.
Yes.
And whilst that will play to a degree, the idea of not jettisoning, but reprioritising melody or music or tunefulness down the ladder a bit across the board won't sit well. So I think this becomes, as you say, a tool in the toolbox of anyone who wants to write a musical. But I don't think the idea that all musicals are going to be like this now is at all going to happen, because musical theatre is incredibly fractured and will remain so.
The thing is, even this isn't like this, if you want to put it that way, because I know you haven't seen it, but I mean, all of Lin-Manuel Miranda's musicals, they're not just a succession of hip hop or rap. No. They are actually, there are soul songs, there are a mixture of there's a lot of Latino stuff in there.
I've spent a certain amount of time looking at.
It's just a fairly standard song. Yeah, exactly.
It is. Yeah.
Doesn't
reprise work well? Even if they
it does very well, yeah. I'll come to that in a minute, actually, what the musical world that inhabits. But basically, it's not the case. And in fact, even if you look at things like Idlewild and the film that the guys from Outkast did, that has a certain amount of hip hop and then an awful lot of soul and R&B sort of stuff in it. So it's never the case that really there's just like one, as you say, it's a tool that's been added to the box. I mean, there have been attempts to do it before, going back into sort of, the mist of time. There's the rap in Starlight Express. There's the Witches rap in Into the Woods.
Yes. Which aren't, though. They're cod.
Well, they are, yeah. They're very... I mean, they're not even pastiche, really. They're just not very successful pastiche. They're just sort of slightly creaky attempts to do this same thing. And, of course, Sondheim was there first, of course, as always, with this sort of rapid fire, getting through a lot of words type of stuff.
Well, I would just... Oh, you say that.
Gilbert and Sullivan before him.
Well, no, actually... Well, yes, all right. I'm going to say the Patter Song, if you like, is the kind of foundation stone. But actually, funnily enough, I have... can I draw everyone's attention to The Monkey Song by Hoagy Carmichael? Now, he's a name to conjure with from the mid-20th century. Worked a lot with Johnny Mercer. Wrote a particular strain of what you might call... popular parochial songs outside of the Hammerstein tradition, but hymning, if you like, in the religious sense, but in a non-religious way, sort of life in the slower states, the sunny, happy times of one's memory, etc., etc. But he wrote not for a musical, but a song for, funny enough, a detective story, a sort of rather grim one, where he's playing a cabaret singer.
Right.
The Monkey Song. And as you can imagine from the title, it's not a serious number. It's about a cannibal king who meets a jazz-playing monkey. They form a band, and then a missionary turns up. A missionary with a Bible and canary come riding on a donkey through the jungle.
Right.
So the king is a little bit short of money, and he wants to sell the jazz-performing monkey to the priest. And they go off to see it, and it turns out that the monkey is just a normal monkey. And then it finishes with a comic payoff, which is actually the king can't understand it. So he suddenly realises it's a dream. And then he says, what's happened to me? What was that all about? I mean, it turns out the priest is there, the missionary is there, and he says, it must have been someone you ate. Because it's a cannibal song. You understand, yes. This is a mid-1940s song.
Yes, I understand. There's a lot of historical context there.
Absolutely. However, if you listen to the lyrics, and this is where I'm going at, funnily enough, they are the tricksy kind of internal rhyming and when I say meandering, I mean not obvious, and non-linear processes that we're more used to. And I have seen it described as a very early proto-rap in a Broadway tradition.
Well, these are formally those are the features of rap. Like there's extreme syncopation in the sense that you have like quintuplets and all sorts of things. Like words are fitted into a rhythm in a way that's not clockworky and regular, but that's actually very flowing and sort of poetic, basically, but still has a strong relationship with the beats and the thing.
Funnily enough, there was a kind of sort of beat bop 1950s thing where a lot of vocal groups would write very complicated lyrics to jazz riffs, which were already famous, and they work a bit like that as well. So.
I mean, there's a lot of Cab Calloway's the usual early example given of that sort of thing. Basically, that's the precursor to hip hop. Anyway, we're getting a little bit lost in history here. Back to the show.
It's a good place to be.
It's a lovely place to be. But back to the show and as it's presented in London. So what we talked about so far is like, why is this a big deal? And those are the reasons that I can see why it's being seen as significant. And
so why is it a big deal in Britain?
Because it's popular.
That's just a different musical just down the road.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I mean, and perhaps maybe some of that same audience.
Can't just be the people who live in Victoria.
It's why is it popular in Britain? I don't know. I mean, to a certain extent, it's just because it's what is big in America can easily be big in Britain, and why shouldn't it be? That's been the case for forever, really. And vice versa. Going back well beyond the Beatles, but. I think people just again see it as something new and fresh, and of course, once something's rolling at that size, then of course just people just get interested in it because it's big, and it's and that's fair enough. So that's driving some of its commercial success. It's like saying, well, why was Les Mis popular in Britain? It's got it's about 1848, which is a period of history in France that nobody knows anything about really here, and we certainly don't learn about it at school. People weren't responding to the historical significance there.
No.
Even the Vietnam musical, exactly. That was only part of it. Its other significance came to the fact that it was just amazingly well written and just buzzed. People got a buzz off it as soon as they heard it, and I assume the same thing is happening here. This is
a fine line with hype, isn't it? Because actually an awful lot of people were talking about it, knowing nothing. I'm going to give you... I've already used this story once on Musical Talk, but I'm going to tell it again because it still astounds me. At Christmas, when it had just opened, I was invited to a very middle-class dinner party.
Right.
Very middle-class.
Very dinner-class.
It was very dinner-class indeed.
You're joining them.
There were some empty-headed people around the table.
A middle-class dinner party?
Yeah, I know, unbelievable.
You astonish me.
And once they finished talking about The Crown... the TV programme, they were very much plugged into what the zeitgeist of the newspapers was telling them was the zeitgeist.
Yes.
We got onto Hamilton.
Right.
Now, apart from the host, no one around the table knew that I had an interest in musical theatre, so I just sat there dumbly, letting them spout on about what Hamilton was.
Yep. You're very good at that.
Thank you. And they had their little chat, and it became very quickly apparent they knew nothing, and everything they were saying is exactly what the television and the newspapers had all been saying, but nothing new, nothing original. They were all talking about it, and then I said to them, could you tell me who Alexander Hamilton was? And this was an excellent question, it turned out, because the answer was, wasn't he an early president of America?
Right, okay.
To which the answer, of course, is no, he was never president.
Of course not.
No,
that's
exactly.
The whole bloody point.
And then the person in particular who was leading the conversation, I said to her, well, I don't think he was president of America, And she said, she said, when I go and see the show, I'll learn about him. Fair enough, good point. She said, after all, everything I know about the French Revolution, I learned from Les Miserables. To which I had the very great pleasure of saying, it's not about the French Revolution.
Or at least not that one, anyway.
Yeah.
Right. Excellent. Yes. Well,
so, actually, I don't think Alexander.
Before we get to
Alexander Hamilton as a person is not known in this
country,
even in terms of American.
Before
founders.
I join in the sneering at that person for not knowing who Alexander Hamilton was, I'm going to just go admit that I never really particularly knew who he was either before I went to see the show. So
you only have to if you're poncing about how marvellous it is.
Exactly. Yeah. So so the show itself. Let's get beyond why it's significant and whether it sort of is doing the things that it claims that it's doing. It does have some commonalities, I think, with Les Mis, in as much as there's, this history has to be told in pretty broad brush strokes.
Yeah.
Like, actually, as I say, the number of words that's used means that it can be told in less broad brush strokes. They don't just have to sort of go about, general remark and this, that, and the other, and there's your context.
Yeah.
Anyway, let's get on with the story about the lovers.
Bring me some flags and some bread.
Exactly. It does sort of, I think, get into some of the more abstruse parts of that particular bit of history, particularly like the fiscal policy, for example, which you don't really hear an awful lot about in Les Mis.
No.
Although you do in Evita. But anyway, so it has that sort of that level of awareness, and obviously one's aware there's a certain amount of simplification going on. And the structure is very interesting to me because essentially, what is the task of a biopic musical? It is to make sense of the life of the person it's about, right? And when I say make sense of, in other words, so you don't just go, this happened, then this happened, then this happened, and then this happened. If you do, you end up usually with a pretty terrible show. Yeah. There has to be some significance, some meaning that comes out of the life of that person that lands at the end, basically.
a journey, in fact, is what we would use in narrative terms. I don't just mean from A to B as in
that's
birth
right.
to
There
death.
has to be a journey.
Yes. How do they progress and develop as a person?
Exactly, and that's quite an interesting question here, because there's a lot of biographical detail to juggle here about somebody who was very ambitious, and I think the recurrent sort of course, one way you do it is you take the thing that happened at the end of their life and you reference it at the beginning, so that it feels like when you get to the end of the life that the thing at the end of their life has cut. Yes, that's right. That we were always going towards this point, and I think Evita is a fairly classic example of how this is done quite well. I think that in effect. Evita is about as was Jesus Christ Superstar before it, so they were just basically writing the same musical again in a way. Is about how does the myth, arise from the person that there was. So there's a person here and there's a myth here.
It's the duality between the real person and the
exactly.
image, or
and
the
I
legacy.
think, and I think this goes to a similar place basically. Certainly, the founding fathers are mythological in America, and then it's sort of saying, well, what was really going on? What was sort of the circumstance? And so it tracks him sort of, through his university days, through this idealism, through to the sort of compromises of his life, and the affairs, and then finally through to this sort of culminatory. I mean, it seems almost quite trivial, duel that he fights with Aaron Burr at the end, and this is where we get to use the line "exit pursued by a Burr."
Very good.
Pursued by a Burr. And that brings it to an end. And I think they use, I think, his son as the sort of the way of trying to sort of make the whole thing cohere together. And that there's an enormous the big number at the beginning that you see in all of the publicity is I'm not throwing away my shot, and it's used at the beginning to mean I will not give up on the chance to change my country. Basically, I will not be, I will not miss my place in history. But of course, it actually refers specifically to what happens in this duel as to whether what the honourable thing is to do, whether one should, faced with the chance of murdering somebody, actually just fire on the grounds that they might be firing. It's a mutually assured destruction thing, right? Or whether it's just as good to just throw away your shot.
So they've done that clever thing of finding both a macro and a micro interpretation of the same phrase.
Yes. So that basically
That's
is
neat.
That is the fundamental mechanism via which sort of there's an attempt to bring coherence. I have to say, I think it comes off nearly, but it's not completely successful in the sense of like it doesn't quite feel like there's that thing. And to be honest, Les Mis has exactly the same problem. You end up at Valjean's deathbed. And then they go, right, what should we do now? He sort of died. I tell you what, let's bring back that song earlier that restores the spirit of the revolution in some way, that's cathartic. And they attempt that. And I've always felt that that's not 100%. Obviously, we all know it so well now that it's difficult to imagine it any other way. And
it's a step back, and a step forward. That's the point.
That's right. And Evita does it by sort of, you start at the funeral and then you just go back in time and then you sort of see how she works her way forward. I think in some ways Evita does it quite successfully because it doesn't attempt... it always stays on the side of the person, not on the side of the myth. Yeah. It doesn't attempt to justify or create the myth or recreate the myth, really, in many ways. It actually, I think, basically says this is somebody who played politics very well, but every single stage was playing politics and the game of ambition and not necessarily
so we shouldn't cry for her in any way.
I suppose that's a good reason not to. And even with Jesus, I think, in Jesus Christ Superstar, they do a similar thing there. So I don't. This is a worldview kind of thing. I think it's is this man as flawed as he is? Does he deserve this place in history? And does he win it through coming from these very humble beginnings as well to go to the very top of, as you were, of American society? So in terms of this structure that it has, I think it is quite hard to draw these quite clear lessons, because I think in the early stages Hamilton is presented as basically a man of principle, like who has political opinions and is not afraid to say them.
Well, you said the word idealist earlier.
Absolutely, yeah, and is in the first act seems to be very much sort of portrayed as this sort of idealist compared to Aaron Burr, this nemesis of his, who basically says that he needs to talk less and smile more and basically be more of a politician, effectively. So we're being given him as a sort of anti-politician. But in the second half, there's an awful lot of compromise in which an affair is had, blackmail is done, embezzlement seems to happen as well from the federal government. And not only that, but...
so he set up the reserve, didn't he?
Indeed, yes. And drew very much upon it, I think, is And this world of sort of political compromise, basically, that characterises the second half. There's also a lot of the financial plan is about, as you say, building up the reserves and basically sort of, fiscal responsibility in effect, which isn't necessarily the sort of thing we associate with the sort of, the revolutionary causes and things. I mean, you've got Jefferson and co on the one hand sort of arguing in effect for it in what we would think of as investment in the country and, righting wrongs and basically spending the money on social justice. And Hamilton's not on that side of the debate. It's a bit of a wonder they didn't go for Jefferson instead. As perhaps that avatar. So I think that's where it runs into slight difficulties, really. I mean, in the sense that
he's actually not a very nice man.
History, who is? None of them, obviously, can be perfect. We're talking about
but Benjamin Franklin's reputation is generally considered to be sort of slightly above the clouds, isn't it? It's
a little bit, yeah.
And George Washington, I think we all know, is not a nice man, but has been whitewashed successfully by history, and it's treason to say otherwise.
Yes, of course.
But Hamilton doesn't quite. I know he's a founding father, but I don't think he's quite revered in that sense.
No,
he's on the banknotes, isn't he?
They're all. I mean, in fact, specifically their particular thing is it's interventionism, basically, where they should be in relation to France. And so in effect,
geographically, exactly where they've always been.
So in effectively, he's to sort of really crudely characterise the positions. He's the isolationist, whereas the others are sort of more the interventionists. And so making common cause with the sort of the revolutionaries in France or the post-revolutionary government there is the sort of flashpoint, if you like, and it's difficult for them to make it like him look like the sort of the hero. And then the rest is sheer sort of struggles for power, really. His attempts to run for president and so on, and Alan Burr's attempts to do the same, and who ends up, with the prizes. It sort of becomes decreasingly relevant as the story goes on. Now, obviously, history doesn't sort of hand down perfect figures, and all the rest of it. As this musical, as much as any observes, they have to be sort of made in retrospect. And that's where they get to in the end is with the final number. Who lives, who dies, who tells your story? So we are sort of in the territory of Evita. It's just like, well, how is the myth made? How is the actual history sort of created? But I feel it sort of stops short of drawing any conclusions on that. It just sort of offers that as a thought about reputation in the way that an awful lot of biographical musicals, I think, often resort to.
Well, this is the problem you were saying with biographical musicals earlier. You were saying that actually, if they are a relatively point-to-point story of their lives, then actually they don't actually amount to anything other than biography.
That's right.
Not drama.
And this is where,
how is this different?
And this is where the amount of biography instead of drama. Well, because it does manage to draw sort of some coherence out of the story. It just doesn't make it. I don't think it just pulls it off entirely. And I think that's sort of it's in that in between place.
But it doesn't ask the rhetorical question at the end about how is history recorded and how a legacy is created. You just said that it slightly does so in a wet way, but not as well as Evita, for example. No. So what is it asking? Is it asking anything? What is its point? What is it saying?
Yeah, well, I think that's to me. I don't 100% feel like I've got that, and I think that if you watch it in the context that I was talking about earlier, that it's just enormously. It has this tremendous feel of significance and
without necessarily having any.
Yeah, kind of. Ooh. Yeah, I think there's a little bit of that.
And what do empty vessels make?
Well, now let's talk about the noises because those are extraordinary and those are good. The score is like. Amazing. It's it's got some.
Is it by a new Shakespeare?
It's certainly got some really excellent numbers in it. I mean, my prejudices are towards the sort of the more melodic ones, just because that's sort of my comfort zone. So I love The Room Where It Happened, for example, which is a jazz number that and has sort of patter elements, I suppose, that describes the great compromise of the moving the capital, and then later is also used to sort of characterise Aaron Burr's desire to be in the room where things happen, to be the guy in charge, or to be at the centre of power, having been marginalised.
So it's clever in that sense. It's once again double using of the same concept.
Yes, it's got My Shot, which is a tremendous tour de force for the performer. Is a physical feat of speech, as you were, and that there's just a lot of words to get through and act and to communicate. Kudos, by the way, to the sound engineers of the Victoria Apollo at the moment, because when words go past that fast. one of the great tragedies of opera and musicals has always been like, you can't always catch what they're actually saying and what they're trying to communicate.
You'll hate me saying this, but this is Gilbert's dictum, that diction is everything.
Well, it's not just diction, because the way that the words are written as well, you can have the most amazing diction in certain kinds of, like we saw Barnum recently. Barnum has got some really smart lyrics if you read them, but there are certain lyrics in there that it took me years to work out what they were actually saying. So, for example, that handsome Hulk might be a Lilliputian mentally, right, is one of the lyrics from Barnum. And to unpack...
He might be an idiot, despite looking good.
Well, that's basically what it's saying, right? But you have to unpack that. You just cannot get that.
You can't do that in real time, no.
Absolutely not. And the diction was great in the version we saw, and you could make it out. It's just that a Lilliputian mentally, it's just really hard to pass. And this musical, and this I think is where the Shakespeare comparison has come from, at least, if not being perhaps necessarily justified, is the skill involved in doing that with that number of words.
So they're
is not to be underestimated. It's absolutely not to be understated. It really matters whether you catch certain things in this show, because it's very plot heavy, and if you don't catch them, it stops making sense. And if you're going to appreciate it, it has to make sense. So I think that's a great achievement here.
And I'm going to ask you a question about rap and hip hop, which I don't know, because it's not a form of music I spend a great deal of time listening to. Except
got to rapidly take my supposed expert card straight off the table here, because I don't. Oh no, same here. But go on.
Well, I'm going to talk about accessibility.
Yeah.
I mean, the only narrow school of rap that I'm involved in is chap hop.
Yeah.
Which I adore, but then again, it's essentially the novelty market end.
Yes.
And it is played for laughs.
Yeah.
I don't really know if actually, because I know, in the most Luddite sense in terms of rap and hip hop, I know that lyrics are important, and the tricksy, meandering, internal rhyming of it all is very significant and useful, but that can work against accessibility. And one of the arguments that has often been against rap is that actually it's quite non-accessible for a lot of people, either because it goes too fast, or that particular meandering nature of the wording is, well, I say meandering, that's wrong, but the tricksy wording is too difficult to pick up in one sitting. Yeah. If this show, you're telling me, has been cleverly thought through and written with enough craft to make sure that accessibility is there, correct, how much of this is cod rap?
Well, it isn't really. I mean, I think that's what it manages to do. Is it manages to hold on to the sort of quintessence of the form. It manages to get its plot points across. It manages to do that without very much sort of reverse phraseology, or the sort of the various techniques that you can use to sort of it sounds more rhymey, so therefore it does not write to its rhymes. It basically tells its story without appearing to compromise on rhyme. It must compromise. There must be compromises in there. You're not aware of them, and that is craft.
That is craft.
It's not. The fact that you can be sort of and again, this is a sort of classic thing that people say about Sondheim, isn't it? And indeed all good lyrics, it's just that you're sort of, well, no, actually not so much. Like the Hammersteinian sort of approach is to sort of say, I want the craft to sort of just be there in the background. Like it's absolutely is a craft, and it's very difficult to do, but the rhymes and things, nothing's going to stand out. It's going to sound like as close to natural speech as I can make it, while still there being some craft involved. And then you've got the more Sondheimy end of lyric writing, where it's like, no, I'm really going to show off. I'm going to sort of have extraordinarily clever rhymes, shepherd's pie pepper with actual shepherd, and all this sort of stuff that really go off like fireworks. But I'm not going to compromise, even while doing that, on the fact that you need to get a message, or there needs to be some sentiment got across. And I think this is
non-naturalistic accessibility in that case.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, and basically, and I'm also going to keep it in the character voice as far as I possibly can. And of course, the great story about Sondheim is that he regretted the way that I Feel Pretty was written, because it was too much fireworks and not enough in the voice of the character, right? So here, same thing. We're talking about highly articulate characters anyway, with university educated, these founding fathers. So we expect them to be verbose and slightly pompous, and we expect them to be, to have a lot
of... Erudite is the more polite term, but yes.
Vocabulary at their command, and indeed we expect them to be good at rhetoric. Yeah. And so that's the character situation, which of course this is why it was a clever decision to choose politicians as the rapping characters, because they got a lot of words.
Yeah.
And
they can manipulate.
And this, is a lot of what hip hop can and does do, is that it makes a point. It's got something to say, that there's some, there's a flow of words, not all of which perhaps are necessary to making that point in a succinct way, but which the rhetorical effect of is enormous. And of course, there are, I suppose if you were looking at the art of hip-hop and the art of rhetoric, and you were looking at sort of repetition and and alliteration, and there's all kinds of rhetorical tricks and litotes and all these sorts of things that people use, and deliberate understatement. And again, you find a lot of that same armory, they're
sharing a toolbox.
Yes, exactly. So I think that's why it's actually quite a smart decision, because people suddenly go, oh yeah, actually, this whole sort of braggadocio that's associated with hip hop is something that we also associate with, that sort of, particularly the revolutionary politicians, particularly the people who want to do statecraft, they want to make new countries and all that sort of stuff, and so it's kind of, so I think that's kind of where that crossover works very well. But fundamentally, to write all of that, to have political ideas, and to try and demonstrate the personal significance of those political ideas while doing interesting things with rhythm and rhyme or half rhyme and all the rest of it, or assonance, that is craft, and that's why the guy is being held up as quite something. And I'm sure he would say, and he sort of does say in the very early stages of In the Heights, he sort of references Cole Porter as where a lot of this sort of stuff comes from, and so it sort of connects to that musical theatre tradition too.
Well, I think you might have just answered one of the questions I was going to ask you, which is the old dictum, content dictates form.
Yep.
This is identified, probably wrongly, because we know it's not just a rap musical, in fact has lots of other forms of music in it, but it's identified as a rap musical for better or for worse. If content dictates form, why does this content need rap?
Yeah, I think that's what I've just said, really. Exactly.
Which is actually, but it seems to me it's interesting. It's not so much it's this symbiosis in outlook, if you like, between the people who created rap, if you like, with an idea of expressing ideas and idealism.
Yeah.
Not that it was always used for that, of course. And with politicians. So I suppose it's the connection between politicians and rap performers as historically understood.
And also there's this sort of, I mentioned the word braggadocio before, and it is a sort of common feature of sort of, bigging oneself up. And in the most famous song of this piece, which, is My Shot, there is that just key declaration, I'm just like my country, I'm young, scrappy and hungry. And that, that sort of quintessentializes that, really. I think it just sort of absolutely sums it up. Effectively, we've got a young, headstrong, arrogant man, here who's, and it is a very natural language for him to use. He's not so much of the soul singer variety. He's not sentimental. He's very sort of,
Firebrandy.
Yeah, and he's focused on the world as it is, and he wants to tell that sort of truth. And so I think it absolutely works for that reason. Just on a side note, and going on to some of the other things, of course, we said earlier we do have George III in there as well as this sort of occasional...
Our man in the picture.
Well, he's the sort of King Herod of the whole thing, if you want to think about it in sort of Andrew Lloyd Webbery terms. There's this sort of...
I so rarely want to do that.
He's sort of got this sort of slightly camp sensibility. And it sort of sets hip-hop and, in effect, sort of, black-originated musics against... what they choose for him is something that sounds somewhere between like Queen, the Electric Light Orchestra, basically the white musicians of the 70s.
White soul, in fact.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. And that's what they give him to sing. I think it is quite like an ELO. It also actually, I noticed that it has, I'm sure this is the case in a lot of songs, but it has the chord sequence of the chorus, da-da-dum, da-da-dum, ba-da-bum, ba-dum, ba-dum, ba-bum, that bit. Has the same chord sequence as Goodbye Stranger by Supertramp, for example, who are a very classic, again, sort of white type of band, really, So I think that's very nice and very cheeky, and it just sort of, just gives this sense of like, well, yes, there's a musical culture as well that sort of, that hip-hop was sort of reacting against or was distancing itself from, that slightly sort of emotionally cool, Eno era sort of, the bands of prog rock or those sorts of, or British pop at that time. And then hip-hop there, coming as this sort of angry contrast to it. This very sort of riled up sort of music, that's very different.
But once again, it's reaction to something, isn't it? Because every action has a positive and equal reaction.
Well, indeed. And a Queen as well, of course, as being this very sort of, there's a lot of flummery, literally, to the band Queen, and the name, even the name sort of,
fairly monarchical.
Yes, exactly. and camp sort of feel to it, which again you get with this George III character, and of course finally this injection of comedy, which is badly needed, I think, to offset the slight pomposity, if you like, of all of the young politicians.
Well, it's interesting as well, isn't it? Because this is one of the very few parts of the show which I have any acquaintance with whatsoever. But I quite like the conceit, because I think the king comes on and sings more or less the same song 3 times, but from 3 different points of view. So once again,
or at 3 different points in the
so it's
story,
that duality, or possibly triology of concept and conceit, and it's a kind of love song, isn't it, in a sense, or a jilted love song. You are my America, you are my lover and partner, and you've rejected me. And then later on, it's kind of second time I'm in pain, and third time is I'm so over you. Get out that door. You're not welcome anymore.
Well, he's sort of irrelevant, isn't he? In the sense of
it's not his story.
It's sort of he's there to sort of just show sort of Britain being
impotent in the circumstances.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, being completely irrelevant to what's going on actually here. Suddenly there's a new force in town, as it were. So. Yeah, it does that much work, and I think it's good. And I think it also, to be honest, it also just it bridges out to other musical culture.
Yeah.
Which actually probably for middle-aged white men like you and me probably does sort of all right, we'll get hold of that.
Easily,
I've heard that, for example, on the radio station that one here's playing in the theatre, and that comes up an awful lot. The George III song, as well as My Shot, the 2 big numbers that are constantly played. There's also the Schuyler Sisters number as well that gets played quite a bit as well. There's a lot more to say about it, a lot more the score, but I think overall, we started with the question of where does the reputation come from, as distinct from the actual thing itself. And I think, it will stand up. I think in 20 years' time there'll be revivals of it. I think, just as with Hair. Will it have a lot of successors? Don't know for certain, but I feel like it probably will. Obviously it'll have success in the sense that, for example, for the 20 years after Les Mis broke through, every musical writer was trying to write their Les Mis and using the same sort of tropes. But those were sort of cliched and not necessarily
loaded.
Yes, it was very felt.
Yes.
But will it be influential in the sense? Will it have successor things? Will it change the form? I suspect so. But we've yet to see exactly to what extent that's going to be true. And as you quite rightly said, as with all culture these days, we've had the Cambrian explosion of popular music forms. It does seem to me, from where I'm sitting, like that we've had most of the major innovations we're going to have in that area for the time being, and now this is just a lot of revisiting and a lot of re-churning up of the same stuff, and that's a general cultural thing. So do we have quite the same notion of a canon where one significant thing, the canon of musical theatre as it's usually presented goes Showboat, Oklahoma, West Side Story, Sondheim arriving on the scene, and then maybe you then pick your next point of departure. Really, is it Rent? Is it Hair? Is it Rocky Horror? Is it lots of different sort of things that have happened since then?
It can go anywhere, and all are true.
Yes, in their different ways, exactly. So Hamilton joins those series of possibilities for the successor of the mainstream of musical theatre.
Or diversifies it even further.
Yeah, or it may well be that we've just got a lot of branches now that are all just going to carry on, and this is going to be one of them. But it's certainly the most recent major branch to be formed, shall we say, the most recent major possibility to be explored in a big way. Yeah. I think it's going to be a branch, not a stump.
I've got one last question for you, Tim. Would you see it again?
Yes, I would.
Well, that's
I think I probably will see it again, just to sort of make it solidified. But the other thing, of course, that I have done is that I've acquired the album, and as with all such things, you don't necessarily see it again, but you certainly get to know it better.
Yes.
And I think that's perhaps the mark of the success, isn't it? I think this musical, and this is certainly nothing new, ever since Lloyd Webber, really, a lot of the musical theatre audience has been driven by people knowing something as a recording first, and then finally deciding to go to see the show, as a result of that. This has done the same thing. That recording, that album, it was a massive success commercially, and I think, a lot of people have picked up on the notion of seeing the show. But the show is just, is the product, but actually in some ways the album is more the product, I think.
How very interesting. I do like that. My own problem, and just to bring this to an end, I think, conversationally, is that although Alexander Hamilton is the father of the American Reserve, I have not shaken off any of my British reserve about this show at all from this conversation. Well, only because everything you say is really interesting. It sounds to me like it had a lot of ducks sitting in the right place. They're lined up in a row to make this successful. There is real craft. There is real success. It touches a lot of American touch points, and I can understand why it's popular there, but I still don't have an understanding why it's popular here yet.
No. Well, I mean...
Because all those things which are significant aren't here.
That may not matter, because who knows why West Side Story was ever popular here, whatever, it didn't speak to the British experience. But, it's
written by Shakespeare.
I guess go see it.
Yeah. Oh, and I will. Yeah. I'm not opposed to it in any way. I do just want to say that I'm not opposed. I've just been driven away by the hype. Yeah.
Well, I think in due course, I think have there been other things where that's happened? Yes, Wicked.
I haven't seen that.
Wicked's not an innovation. I mean,
no, and I was driven away by the hype.
Mamma Mia, if you want to sort of name massively successful musicals.
I did see that, but it wasn't. Funny enough, I think.
Well, I've avoided it, and I still have avoided it to this day. So that's good 20 years now. But
I think the hype came after that was created. I think the hype followed it being a success.
Well, it followed the ridicule, probably.
Yeah, it was not expected to be successful.
As is the case in a lot of these. This one hasn't had ridicule, I don't think. Les Mis did. Les Mis was much satirised, as was Rent, of course. At the time, people did sort of think it rather silly. But this one, I don't think. Yeah, well, I suppose it is. But this one hasn't had quite that same reaction.
That worries me as well, though. There's that sense.
Well, don't worry, it'll come.
There's that sense of po-faced reverence. I don't like reverence.
No, I think that's something that that does exist around this. It does have a bit of a halo of cultural. Virtue, shall we say? As again has been the case with other things in the past, but yeah, I think it's certainly. I feel it's earned it to quite an extent from this perspective, anyway.
Well, Tim, thank you very much indeed. When I have seen this, we'll have another conversation about Hamilton. So, are you free in 5 years' time?
Yes, exactly. Yes,
Not only is that when the first tickets are going to be available, but I think it will take me 5 years to swallow my bile.
Yeah. No, we'll meet up and see. Well, let's wait for the first revival, shall we? And then go look at the National or something like that, and we'll go see that and see what we make of it.
Perfect. Tim, thanks very much.
Cheers.
Musical talk. And there we have it. Tim Saywood there explaining why he thinks that Hamilton is not just a good show, but an important show. And I have to stress again that I have no ill will towards the show. I'm sure it's excellent. I just don't vastly fancy it. And call me old-fashioned if you will, I'm going to end this show on where I came in, essentially, which is, if you were asking me whether I prefer to see Hamilton or Curtains, I'm afraid it's Curtains for me every time. But then again, it wouldn't do if we all had exactly the same views, would it? And I am looking forward to seeing 21 Chump Street, as a kind of taster menu for Lin-Manuel Miranda's very excellent skills. Well, that's it for this week's edition of Musical Talk. I do hope that if you find yourself in lockdown, that things aren't too bleak for you. And I hope that you're listening to lots of podcasts, not just Musical Talk, but there's plenty out there about plenty of subjects. And if that doesn't tickle your fancy, why don't you start one about something that does tickle your fancy? Musical Talk will be back next week with a conversation about something completely different. That is what we do, after all. So until that time, it must be time for me to say goodbye from my seat of solitary loneliness. You know I'm here too still. Oh dear, the voices. Well, it is only a matter of time before they come to us all. At least I know what mine look like. Goodbye. This episode of Musical Talk edited by Thos Ribbits, presented by Thos Ribbits and Tim Saywood. Copyright Musical Talk 2020. To find out more about the world of Musical Talk and listen to past episodes, go along to our website www.musicaltalk.co.uk or subscribe to us on iTunes and follow us on Facebook, Instagram and Twitter. And if you want to follow me on Twitter, you can at Musical Talk Thos. How do you want to do this? As an insert? Do you want to do an introduction? Have you got enough?
I don't think I've got enough. I think I've probably got about 20 minutes here max.
Maybe
a touch more.
Who's Max?
Oh. And so it's always, I think, going to feel more important in America than probably it's going to here. But that's something...
That's my... Do you mind just saying that last sentence again?
Yep.